In September AD 25, outside the walls of Chang'an, heavy armies gathered. It was a very unusual sight. The attacking army and the defending army both flew the banners of Han. Black fields, vermilion borders, dark red streamers. The only difference was this. Unlike the attackers' crude, hastily stitched together banners, the Han soldiers standing behind the battlements used flags made from the silk stored in Chang'an's arsenals, with straight, orderly poles, fine fabric, and even borders and streamers made according to Han regulations. They still carried the image of legitimate imperial majesty. And yet, by the time the struggle for Chang'an had reached the city gates, the outcome was already beyond doubt. The attackers, whose banners and formations were both in complete disorder, pushed forward a captive. The general holding him shouted toward the gate of Chang'an, "Open the gate, and your elder brother will live." What choice did the commandant defending the gate have? His loyalty could not withstand the hundreds of thousands of soldiers outside the walls. His feelings for the emperor inside Chang'an were far weaker than his fear for his own elder brother's life. And besides, the general shouting beside the captive had not long before been his own superior. Only he had surrendered to the enemy a step earlier. So the gate of Chang'an opened. Those rough makeshift Han banners swept in like a red whirlwind, like a flood. When the emperor learned that the gate guards had surrendered, there was nothing he could do. Even the palace guards around him had already scattered. He fled Chang'an Palace alone, mounted a horse, and tried to break out of the city toward the west. Just as he climbed into the saddle, many consorts and palace women rushed out of Chang'an Palace after him. Through their tears, they shouted at the fleeing emperor, "Your Majesty, you have failed this imperial city. You must dismount and apologize to it before you leave." Whether these desperate accusations truly moved him, or whether the panic in his own heart had already unsettled him, the emperor named Liu Xuan really did dismount. He bowed and knocked his head toward the palace city, then mounted again. Alone on a single horse, in a state of total disorder, he fled out through the western gate of Chang'an. At that moment, only 18 months had passed since he had entered Chang'an amid thunderous cries of "Long live the Emperor!" And 17 years had passed since the Han Dynasty had been seized by WangMang. The flames of war were still flying. The realm was far from pacified. Suffering still spread through the world without end. 8 years earlier, around AD 17, the Xin Dynasty, founded by the usurper WangMang, had already been dragged into the mud by its own reforms. The currency system changed again and again. Policies on land and slaves were idealistic in name only. Local administrations enforced them harshly. Collective punishment, taxes, labor service, and military requisitions all intensified layer by layer. To officials in Chang'an, these may still have seemed like institutional adjustments. To ordinary people in the provinces, they meant that grain was taken away, coins suddenly became worthless, entire families were implicated, and flight became the only choice left. Rebellion finally began first on the eastern coast. There was a wealthy woman known as Lu Mu. Her son was only a minor county clerk, but he was executed by the county magistrate for a petty offense. In peaceful times, the wrongful killing of a low-ranking official might have been only one injustice among many. At the end of an empire, it could become the spark for an uprising. Lu Mu did not raise a banner immediately. She used her family wealth to brew wine, buy swords, prepare clothing, extend credit to young men, and lend money to the poor, slowly gathering people's loyalty. When those young men later wanted to repay her, she wept and told them that she had not done this for profit. The county magistrate had wrongfully killed her son, and she wanted revenge. So a private vendetta became an armed movement. Lu Mu led her followers into the islands and marshes off the coast, gathered fugitives, expanded to several thousand people, called herself a general, attacked the county seat, and captured the magistrate. She beheaded him, used his head as an offering to her son, and then withdrew back to the sea. Lu Mu died not long afterward, and her followers gradually dispersed, flowing into other armies of starving people that were rising one after another. At almost the same time, the south also began to break down. Famine struck. Large numbers of people starved to death. The survivors entered wild marshes and dug up wild plants to stay alive. Because the starving fought one another over food, leaders naturally emerged to mediate disputes, and these men were chosen as commanders. At first, these starving people numbered only a few hundred. Later, fugitives from nearby commanderies and counties joined them one after another. The food in the marshes was not enough either, so they rushed out, first plundering and attacking nearby villages and settlements, then hiding in the mountains. In only a few months, they grew to 7,000 or 8,000. By coincidence, the place where these people fleeing into the forests merely to survive finally chose to hide was called Lülin, which if translated into English is almost the Greenwood. Of course, they were not medieval English outlaws, nor were they heroes from some romantic legend. But at least at this moment, when they were still only starving people, fugitives and the oppressed, they did resemble Robin Hood and his companions in one sense. They were righteous outlaws standing outside a corrupt order. Later generations would call them the Lülin Army, the Greenwood Army. Less than a year later, the situation in the north also changed dramatically. Near the region where Lu Mu had risen in rebellion, a man named Fan Chong led a starving people's uprising. At first, he had only a little more than 100 followers. Later, he moved into Mount Tai. At the time, famine affected many northern regions, and bandits rose everywhere. Groups of outlaws, including the remnants of Lu Mu's followers, kept joining him. Within a year, his force grew to more than 10,000. Under his example, small armed bands and starving rebel groups around him continually merged into his movement, gradually forming a massive armed body of displaced people. They did not seize cities and hold territory. They did not manage taxation. They had no complete official system. Only after their numbers grew did they agree on a simple code. Murderers would die. Those who injured others would compensate the victim. The highest leaders were called 3 elders. Those below them were called officers, and below them were soldier clerks. Among themselves, they used the broad term subjects, or men of the group. This crude order allowed the army to survive in chaotic times and to sweep up more starving people. But it was very hard for such a force to restore grain production, repair roads, collect taxes, appoint officials, or settle those who surrendered. This was the foreshadowing of the tragedy to come. They resisted a collapsing state, but they themselves did not possess the ability to replace the state. As more and more rebel forces appeared across the realm, they gradually moved from hiding in mountains and marshes into armed plunder. This inevitably brought attacks from regular armies. In AD 21, a regular force of 20,000 troops from Jingzhou was sent to suppress the Lülin army. Unexpectedly, it was defeated by these roving rebels. Several thousand soldiers were killed, and all their supplies and baggage were lost. The Lülin army then took advantage of the victory to attack surrounding commanderies and counties, bringing back large numbers of people. Its numbers expanded to more than 50,000. From that moment on, it was no longer merely a band of starving people hiding in mountains and marshes. It had become a military force in the Jingzhou region that no one could ignore and no local authority could deal with alone. The next year, the northern situation also reached its symbolic turning point. WangMang saw Fan Chong's forces in the north as a mortal threat and sent more than 100,000 elite troops eastward to crush them. Although the rebels were heavily outnumbered, the Xin army plundered freely wherever it went. People even said they would rather meet the Red Eyebrows than meet the government army. That folk saying revealed the direction of popular feeling more clearly than any political slogan could. WangMang's empire had lost its moral foundation. Fan Chong laid a trap, and in a desperate battle smashed the main Xin force. During the fighting, Fan Chong and his men worried that friend and foe could not be distinguished in the chaos, so they ordered their followers to paint their eyebrows red. From this, the northern rebel army received its name, the Red Eyebrows. From then on, the Red Eyebrows in the north and the Lülin army in the south grew ever stronger, eventually becoming a flood that swept across all of China. But almost at the same time, the two movements began to take completely different paths. In the south, the Lülin army suffered a plague that killed nearly half of its people and forced the survivors to operate separately. As they fought, plundered, and expanded in order to survive, they gradually developed close ties with armed members of the Han Imperial clan in Nanyang Commandery. In the winter of AD 22, Liu Yan of Nanyang rose in arms and made contact with the Xin and Pinglin factions of the Lülin movement. At first, the different groups did not trust one another. They even resented each other over the division of property. Later, the young Liu Yan handed over the goods acquired by his own clan to all the armies, temporarily easing the tension. Through extensive persuasion, Liu Yan then convinced the various Lülin factions to form a military alliance with the Liu clan forces. By the first month of AD 23, this alliance had openly raised the name of Han, attacked the Xin forces in the south, killed the Xin generals sent to suppress them, slaughtered more than 20,000 soldiers, and then pressed the advantage by besieging the major city of Wang. In February AD 23, after seeing the advantage of raising the Han banner, the Lülin generals decided to enthrone a member of the Liu clan as a new emperor in order to unify command. Yet Liu Yan, though he himself was a member of the Han Imperial clan, opposed declaring an emperor too early. He pointed out that the Red Eyebrows in the north were extremely numerous. If the Lülin forces first enthroned one Liu, the Red Eyebrows might enthrone another. WangMang had not yet been destroyed. If members of the Liu clan began competing with one another first, they would only damage their own authority. Liu Yan argued that they should temporarily declare a king, and only after defeating WangMang and bringing the Red Eyebrows to submission should they proclaim an emperor. But the generals no longer wished to wait. One Lülin commander even struck the ground with his sword and said that hesitation could never accomplish great things. Today's decision, he declared, allowed no second opinion. So they began to discuss which member of the Han Imperial clan should become the new emperor. If ability and prestige alone had mattered, Liu Yan would have been the obvious choice. He had reputation, courage, and seemed far more like a man capable of restraining armies and integrating local powers. But the Lülin generals, many of them commoners by birth and used to loose conduct, feared his stern authority. Instead, they chose his distant cousin, Liu Xuan, a descendant of the Prince of Changsha, a far weaker figure. The histories record that when Liu Xuan ascended the throne, he was so ashamed that he sweated and could not even raise his hands to speak. But regardless of that, in AD 23, his court was the only anti-Xin center under heaven with the greatest claim to legitimacy. Liu Xuan announced a new reign title, Gengshi, renewal, a new beginning. For this reason, the new Han central regime that had emerged from the Lülin army became known as the Gengshi regime, and Liu Xuan became known as the Gengshi Emperor. To people who had long lived under WangMang's reforms and military oppression, this new court was hope. It meant the usurper could be overthrown, the old calendar and reign order could be restored, and the commanderies and counties could once again return to the order of the Han House. The coming Battle of Kunyang pushed that hope to its peak. When WangMang heard that the Liu clan in the south had proclaimed an emperor, he was terrified. He sent south an army said to number 1 million, including 420,000 armored troops. The army assembled at Luoyang. WangMang also recruited men versed in military texts to serve as officers, and used giants, tigers, leopards, rhinoceroses and elephants to magnify the army's spectacle. With the empire's last strategic main force, he intended to crush this newly founded Han regime in one blow. But the Xin commanders made a fatal mistake. Instead of bypassing Kunyang and marching straight toward Wan, they first surrounded this small city in order to display their power. In the decisive Battle of June, a member of the Imperial clan not yet 30 years old, the younger brother of Liu Yan, led 3,000 men willing to die and charged directly into the Xin army's center. In a sudden torrential rain, the Xin deputy commander was killed. The defenders of Kunyang shouted and surged out, attacking from inside and outside at the same time. Then meteorites fell from the sky, dark clouds seemed to collapse downward, thunder roared, rain poured, rivers swelled, and the wild beasts panicked. The great Xin army collapsed. After this battle, the Gengshi regime had militarily destroyed the last Xin main force capable of suppressing the realm. After the battle, the Guangdong region shook with fear. Heroes and strongmen across the land killed their governors and administrators, called themselves generals, used the Han reign title, and waited to surrender to the Gengshi regime. In other words, at that moment, the Gengshi regime was not merely a local separatist power. It was the center toward which the realm was turning. Politically, it represented the revival of Han. Militarily, it had shattered WangMang's main army. It seemed that the empire was finally about to stand up again from collapse. Yet the moment victory arrived, the cracks appeared in the open. After Kunyang, Liu Yan's prestige grew even higher, and the Lülin generals of common birth feared him even more. At just this moment, one of Liu Yan's subordinates publicly refused to obey Liu Shen, arguing that it was Liu Yan and his brother who had achieved the great work of remaking the realm. What, he asked, was Liu Shen? With the encouragement and support of the Lülin commanders, Liu Shen arrested this subordinate. When Liu Yan heard the news, he stepped forward and argued the case. But this was a trap long in preparation. The Lülin generals seized the opportunity to urge Liu Shen to pull the problem up by the roots. Liu Yan was arrested as well and killed that very day. This was the first great act of political self-destruction by the Gengshi regime. The man it killed was not an ordinary general. He was the strong figure most likely to unite the Lülin army, the Liu clan and local heroes. But objectively speaking, such a conflict would have erupted sooner or later. The greater failure of Liu Shen and the Gengshi regime came after WangMang's destruction. In October AD 23, the Lülin forces pressed their advantage and entered Guangdong. Rebel troops inside Chang'an rose in response. WangMang retreated to the Jian terrace and was eventually killed. Luoyang was also captured by the Gengshi forces, and high ministers of the Xin regime were executed. Militarily, the Gengshi regime reached its peak. Nanyang, Luoyang, and Chang'an had all returned one after another to the Han name, and the commanderies and kingdoms under heaven nominally submitted. In October, Liu Shen entered Luoyang. local officials once again saw the dignity and ritual bearing of Han officials, and many old clerks wept with emotion. For people who had experienced the institutional chaos of WangMang, the restoration of old forms was itself a powerful political comfort. But the Gengshi court failed to grasp the true key to the situation. After WangMang's death, Fan Chong and the other leaders of the Red Eyebrows heard that the Han house had been restored. They too came to Luoyang with more than 20 commanders, expressed submission, and accepted investiture from the Gengshi regime. This was the best opportunity to unify all anti-Xin forces. Liu Shen accepted their surrender, but gave them a settlement that was perfunctory to the point of insult. Fan Chong and the others received only empty noble titles as marquises, without actual fiefs. Their hundreds of thousands of followers received no plan for grain supply, provisioning, or stationing. Fan Chong and the others soon discovered that, apart from a hollow title, they had received nothing at all. Meanwhile, the troops they had left behind, now leaderless, had already begun to scatter. To avoid being completely stripped of power, Fan Chong and the others fled Luoyang and returned to their own camp. This was a turning point enough to make any statesman beat his chest in regret. If the Gengshi regime had shown enough breadth and wisdom at this moment, even if it had only produced a barely acceptable plan for integration, it might have absorbed the largest armed force of the time into the state army and truly completed the unification of the realm. But it did not. With empty titles and indifference, it pushed the Red Eyebrows back into opposition and created for itself the gravedigger that would one day bury it by hand. This fully exposed the nature of the Gengshi regime. It was a loose coalition of warlords. It could share hardship and overthrow a common enemy, but it could not share wealth and honor, much less build a governing system broad enough to include all under heaven and orderly enough to rule. In February AD 24, Liu Xuan moved from Luoyang into Chang'an. In ancient Chinese politics, this should have been an extremely important symbol. The capital had once again welcomed a Liu emperor. The usurper had been killed, the ancestral temples might be restored, and the realm seemed to have returned to the proper track. When WangMang fell, Chang'an had certainly suffered war, but apart from some burned palaces, many palace buildings, granaries, arsenals, government offices and markets still largely remained. This regime did not hold an empty wasteland. It possessed the most important political assets of the old empire. Yet after entering Chang'an, the Lülin commanders quickly revealed the true nature of a mountain and marsh alliance. Weiyang Palace was destroyed. Liu Xuan moved into Changlei Palace, but in the face of old court rituals, he became timid and lost composure. When the Lülin generals came to court, Liu Xuan actually asked them how much they had seized in plunder. The old officials in the palace stared at one another in shock. Afterward, he widely rewarded meritorious followers, completely breaking the early Han political principle that no one outside the Liu clan should be made a king. He made many Lülin generals of common birth into kings. A folk rhyme spread through Chang'an. The man who raised horses and cooked in the kitchen can become a palace gentleman. The man who sold rotten sheep stomachs can become a cavalry commandant. The man who sold rotten sheep heads can become a marquis within the passes. The prestige of office and rank was rapidly destroyed. State positions became shares of military loot and private favors. Someone submitted a memorial of remonstrance, warning that using temporary soldiers as the ministers of state was like climbing a tree to look for fish. It could never succeed. Liu Xuan did not accept the advice. Instead, he threw the remonstrator into prison. Liu Xuan himself had no ambition. The realm had not yet been fully pacified, but he hid day and night in the inner palace, drinking with women. Ministers often could not see him when they came to report affairs. One favored woman even became so angry when official business interrupted drinking that she smashed the writing table. After this, Guanzhong turned away from him, and resentment and rebellion spread in all directions. Worse still, generals sent out from the capital each appointed their own governors and administrators. The provinces and commanderies did not know whom they were supposed to obey. The most basic questions of state power had appeared. Who had the authority to appoint officials? Who could collect grain? Who could restrain armies? Who could represent the central government? The Gengshi regime occupied Chang'an, but it did not truly govern Chang'an. It had an emperor, but it did not build an administrative machine capable of making the provinces obey. It was still an alliance of rebels, only now wearing the clothing of an emperor and a court. There are always people under heaven who can see through the corruption and illusion inside Chang'an. That winter, the Red Eyebrows decided to attack Chang'an from the west. They entered Guanzhong in two routes, transforming themselves from a northern force of starving people into direct challengers to the Gengshi central regime. But they also faced a problem. Without an emperor, without a reign title, without the name of the Liu clan, they were still only a mob of bandits. Before long, as the Red Eyebrows advanced westward, a brief but important episode occurred first in Guanzhong in the first month of AD 25. The last crown prince of the Western Han, the puppet Liu Ying, who had been displaced by WangMang before he ever ascended the throne, was found and enthroned as son of heaven. Gengshi immediately sent troops to suppress the revolt, and Liu Ying and those who supported him were quickly killed. Though brief, this event showed that by AD 25, the name of Han had already shattered. Perhaps it was precisely the affair of Liu Ying that gave the Red Eyebrows an idea. On the one hand, they fought major battles against the Gengshi armies in Guanzhong. On the other, they also began building the legitimacy of their own regime. It is said that a local shaman claimed the spirit of Prince Jing of Chengyan, the grandson of Liu Bang, founding emperor of the Western Han, and the Marquis of Jushu, Liu Jiang, who had rendered great service in suppressing the Lu clan rebellion and whom we have introduced in a previous video, had become angry. His descendants, the spirit supposedly said, ought to be sons of heaven. How could they go on being bandits forever? Fan Chong and the others seized the opportunity to search the army for descendants of Prince Jing of Chengyan. They really did find 3 brothers. The Red Eyebrow generals used the drawing of lots to decide who would become the new son of heaven. In the end, the lot fell to a boy who herded cattle in the Red Eyebrow army. His name was Liu Panzi. The Red Eyebrow generals immediately bowed to him as subjects. This 15-year-old boy had loose hair, bare feet, and ragged clothing. When he saw everyone bowing to him, he was so frightened he wanted to cry. He even bit the lot he had drawn in two, threw it away, and ran back to his former superior, ready to keep herding cattle. But history did not need his consent, and neither did the Red Eyebrow army. The Red Eyebrows immediately announced that this Liu Panzi had been established as the new Han Son of Heaven, and they immediately began rewarding meritorious followers. This scene, full of theatrical absurdity, shows that this regime was from its birth a temporary legitimization of a military group. The emperor was only a symbol. The generals held the armies. The court was only a name. The camp was the reality. At the same time, the local strongman Gongsun Shu proclaimed himself emperor in Shu in April. In Hebei, the former Gengshi general, the younger brother of Liu Yan who had escaped death, proclaimed himself emperor in June. Chang'an still had Liu Xuan. The Red Eyebrows now had Liu Panzi. For a time, 4 emperors stood side by side under heaven. For ordinary people, this was not revival. It was the complete shattering of order. Every emperor claimed to represent heaven's mandate. Every army needed grain. Every locality might be passed through and plundered by the next army of righteousness. After the Red Eyebrows enthroned Liu Penza, Chang'an had already begun to collapse from within before the enemy even arrived. Some generals conspired to seize Liu Xuan, plunder Chang'an, and then return east. When Liu Xuan learned of this, he pretended to be ill and refused to appear. Then he summoned them into the palace, intending to kill them. The plot was exposed, and these Lülin generals counterattacked, burned the gates, and stormed into the palace. Liu Xuan was badly defeated and fled to Xinfeng with his wife and more than 100 mounted attendants and carriages. Afterward, he suspected that other ministers with troops had also conspired with these rebels, and he killed their subordinates. The situation finally turned into civil war. The two sides fought inside Chang'an for more than a month. The Red Eyebrows outside the city had not yet truly broken in, but the Gengshi generals inside the city were already slaughtering one another. In the end, the rebels opposing Liu Xuan were driven out of Chang'an. They then surrendered to the Red Eyebrows and joined forces with them to attack Chang'an. This is the background to the opening scene in which the gate of Chang'an was opened. It was not simply a siege by an external enemy. It was a regime that first disintegrated internally and then led an outside enemy into its own capital. Liu Xuan fled alone on horseback. Most of the Gengshi ministers and generals surrendered. Only a few resisted and died. Facing Liu Xuan, whose whereabouts were unknown, the Red Eyebrows, now occupying Chang'an, issued a proclamation ordering him to surrender, promising that he could be made a king. Soon afterward, Liu Xuan personally returned to Changlei Palace and presented the imperial seal of state to Liu Penza. The Gengshi regime had fallen. But could the Red Eyebrows, now occupying Chang'an, do any better? History gave an even more despairing answer. After entering Chang'an, the Red Eyebrows quickly repeated all the mistakes of the Gengshi regime, only in a more primitive and more brutal way. They established no effective administrative system in Chang'an. Officials at all levels and local magnates built fortresses one after another and refused to supply them with grain. The Red Eyebrows' solution to the grain problem was simple and savage: plunder. Loot one city, then loot the next. The cattle-herd emperor lived in Changlei Palace, but the generals had no sense of hierarchy or restraint. They often brought wine and meat into the palace halls, shouting and making noise. Some even drew swords and struck the pillars, fighting one another for credit. Officials trying to maintain order were often threatened with weapons by these fierce commanders and had no power to control them. By the year-end sacrificial day, the Red Eyebrows held a great banquet in the palace. Drunk soldiers and commanders, fighting over merit, actually began killing one another in front of Liu Penza. Soldiers outside the palace simply tore down the palace gates, rushed in, and plundered wildly. On that day, the chaos inside Chang'an reached its peak. Everywhere there was burning, killing, robbery, and pillage. Liu Penza was so frightened that he cried day and night. The Red Eyebrow leaders finally understood that if things continued like this, they would not even be able to keep this puppet. When Liu Penza threatened to give up the throne, the Red Eyebrow generals hypocritically admitted their faults, helped him back to the imperial seat, and ordered everyone to return to their camps. But this order lasted only a little more than 20 days. After that, everything returned to the way it had been. At its core, the Red Eyebrow regime was a massive roving bandit army. It had neither the instinct nor the will to govern a state. By the first month of AD 26, under Red Eyebrow rule, Chang'an had completely descended into hell. All the grain reserves had been exhausted. There was nothing left to seize. This great imperial capital of the Han Dynasty had become a vast, dead city. Palaces, government offices, private homes, anything that could burn had been burned. The streets were filled with corpses of the starved. Facing a ruin that could no longer feed them, the Red Eyebrows made their final decision: leave. Before leaving, they killed Liu Xuan, gathered up the remaining treasures in the palace, and on a day of heavy snow, set fire to what was left of the palace complex. Then they opened the gates and, like locusts crossing the land, swept westward toward the Long Mountains. Behind them, the once densely populated and immeasurably wealthy imperial capital of Chang'an was left with only raging fire and endless desolation. The dream of restoring Han had now been utterly broken. From Lu Mu's grievance, to the famine of the Lülin, to the migration and plunder of the Red Eyebrows, these enormous forces that erupted from the very bottom of the empire succeeded in destroying an old dynasty. But then, on the ruins they themselves had created, they immediately exposed all their limitations. A lack of organization, no foresight, extreme internal conflict, and a habit of plunder. They could not establish order. They could not restore production. They could not even feed themselves. They used violence to overthrow a tyranny, and then produced an even more chaotic and more brutal tyranny. The empire's first great collapse ultimately proved one thing. On the ashes of the old order, rage alone and the instinct to survive cannot grow new grain. This great melee that began with peasant rebellion did not save China. Instead, it dragged the country into a deeper, darker, bloodier abyss. The answer, perhaps, could only be found among those competitors who possessed the same ambition, but also understood restraint, order, and construction. And their story had only just begun.